They'd have a world full of strip malls, plants grown by biotech. As long as they get richer, they just don't give a heck. But we don't want their eco-side. We want a world we can live in. That's why we're here to stay, and we're not gonna give in. We'll shut them down. I think Sherry Hunkala is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met, and one of the most effective activists on the planet. I worship the ground she walks on. So I think she's always just doing really great stuff, trying to bring attention to the plight of approximately 100 million Americans who are barely making ends meet, and others who aren't making ends meet, of course, like so many of the people who are actually staying in Romneyville, and so many of the people involved with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign and the Kensington Welfare Rights Union, who are really in very, very difficult straits, you know. So I think she's brilliant, and in terms of the situation here in Tampa, I mean, it's like, unfortunately, it's so surreal, it's so Kafkaesque, it's almost like unbelievable, but it's still actually standard procedure at every protest since the WTO protests in Seattle in '99. It's pretty much standard procedure to have a ridiculously disproportionate police presence. But what is so especially outrageous is that, at least in Seattle and at A16 and April 16th, 2000 in Washington D.C. and at the 2000 conventions and at other events in 2004, the Republican convention, at various events, at least there's been tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. So the outrageously disproportionate police presence doesn't seem quite as outrageously disproportionate. But in this case, it's just, this is the most outrageously disproportionate I've ever seen. I mean, for people who are just watching your interviews who are not here, I mean, it is hard for anybody who's not here to understand just what a ghost town downtown Tampa is, and downtown St. Petersburg, which they've done the same thing to, even worse actually. I mean, you just can't move. There's just fences everywhere. There's police everywhere. I mean, there is no rationale for how much security there is. What they were always talking about was the possibility of terrorist attacks and preventing that and all that. So to some extent, in that regard, given, of course, that they're protecting a bunch of war criminals who are bent on bombing the entire Muslim world, and the threat of terrorism is, for quite obvious reasons, a real threat, and it always will be as long as we keep on bombing everybody, no matter how much security they do. But what's so clear is, although they said that all this security was really about terrorism, it becomes very clear over the past few weeks that the terrorism they're talking about is domestic terrorism, and specifically left-wing terrorism, which has not actually existed in any significant form since about 1921. And so when Wall Street was bombed by people taking vengeance against the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, I believe it was 21. Since then, there has been no significant acts of violence carried out by any left-wing or group or individual in the United States that I'm aware of, with some fairly minor exceptions in the late 1960s. So what they are doing, quite obviously for anybody who's been around for more than a few years and has seen this, what they are doing here and what they've been doing in the media, in the mainstream media over the past few weeks in terms of the hype, and with the police presence here now, what they are doing is trying to make sure that we understand that this is not a democracy, this is a one-party state, and we're not allowed to demonstrate, and if we try to demonstrate, we should be very scared of the possibility of being beaten and arrested, or worse. And this is exactly what they are trying to demonstrate here, and they're very effectively demonstrating just that. So anybody that believes that we have freedom of expression in this country has obviously never been to a protest before. I was planning on it originally, but I wasn't hearing about a whole lot of protest activity being planned, and I didn't want to just hang around. I mostly feel more useful if I'm singing at events where there's at least some kind of an audience, so I didn't have any clue that there was anything like that going to be happening, so I made other plans to go to Europe. Yeah, I mean, basically, there's what we have here mostly, other than local progressives, is the real hardcore of the left from throughout the United States, and that is what you find at protests, national protests like conventions and meetings of the elite and stuff like that. That's what you'll find when there's not really a mass movement happening in the country to speak of. And the evidence of a lack of a mass movement is very powerful when you come to a place like this where the police are prepared for protests that never were going to happen, of a scale that was never going to happen. So, there's some people here locally who have worked their asses off to organize some fantastic events, no question about that. But the kind of like the large numbers of people plugging into the whole thing isn't happening, not for lack of effort, but for lack of a mass movement. And which is an important distinction, because I think there's absolutely nothing to be said of any sort that no criticism that should fairly be put out there towards any of the organizers, who are all doing a kick-ass job. It's just that the people aren't coming, and the people aren't coming because there's not a mass movement, and there's not a mass movement because there's not a sense of optimism in the country, and there has not been a sense of optimism in the country since about 2005. And I travel around the country and play gigs and hang out with people on the left, so I think I have a pretty good finger on the pulse of what the mood is. And there was a real optimistic, powerfully optimistic mood in the country from about 1999 until 9/11, and that was what we might call the anti-capitalist movement, which started out being fairly small, but it was really growing in leaps and bounds. It was facing immense police brutality, but it was still growing. And then when 9/11 took the wind out of the sails for a variety of complex reasons, basically mostly having to do with the equating activism with terrorism on the part of the authorities and the corporate media, and so many people's inability to deal with that, and a sense of sort of defeat and inevitability about the wars and about everything that Bush was going to use this disaster of 9/11 to capitalize on, to carry out all kinds of terrible policies, including wars, policies and privatization and militarization, etc., and taking away free speech. Obama has continued the Bush policies, as people know who actually are paying attention, who are not just worshiping Democrats because they're handsome and black and eloquent and whatever else. Obama is a corporate stooge. He's a very eloquent one, good-looking one, etc., but he's a corporate stooge. The difference between him and Bush is he talks a much better line and he's a lot smarter. And he seems like he's good at coming off as one of us, and you would hope that somebody who's leading a country of 300 million people would be a good enough actor to come off as one of us, but he's not. He's a servant of the corporate elite through and through, and he has been for a long time. And so is the entire leadership of the Democratic National Committee, and without question, that's also true of the entire leadership of the Republican National Committee. But this has become standard procedure, though, and this outrageously disproportionate police response to protest, and it's really it's just and the fact that so many local people in all these different protests in Tampa and in other cities where these things have happened, especially places that are not like New York or Boston or San Francisco, but places where they're not used to having big protests, the local people, what scares me the most is the local people look at this and they think, oh, this is how police deal with protests. Protests are really scary and bad, and look at these protesters, there's not very many of them, and they develop these impressions, and then they get used to it, just like people get used to, from watching cops on TV so much, they get used to, well, this is how cops do it, and this is what they have to do, and so they get kind of immunized, inured to it, and it's something that we should never be used to, this kind of thing. But a mass movement, it only happens when there's a sense of optimism and a sense that something can be accomplished, and that feeling of optimism existed for about 1 month in 2006 during the immigrant rights protests, and it existed for last fall during the Occupy movement for about 2 months. And of course, what you see here around you, what maybe it would be unfair for me to call remnants of the Occupy movement, but of course the Occupy movement, it continues just as the anti-capitalist movement of 12 years ago continues to some extent, but they are both, as far as I can tell, really pale shadows of their former selves. And neither movement was ever all that big, but they both were very promising, and they were both really stopped by massive police brutality, and that really can't be overemphasized. 7,000 arrests last fall of Occupy activists, and this is what it wasn't so much the winter as the 7,000 arrests that really stopped people from being able to stay outdoors, and that was, people want to put a good face on it, but having outdoor spaces like that to hold down was just as important for the Occupy movement as it was for the Tompkins Square movement in New York City in the 80s. I mean, you need public spaces that are controlled by the people. That's the first step in creating a mass social movement that really make a difference. You need people willing to get arrested. You need to have a lot of people willing to commit daily acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. And when you have that, you can overthrow a government nonviolently, and we saw that happen in Tunisia and in Egypt. And the authorities here, although they and the corporate press belittle activists and try to make us all seem as marginal as possible, which is not very difficult since many of us are, they actually are in fear of the possibility of a social movement growing and becoming powerful the way it did in Tunisia and Egypt. And they know, if they didn't know it before, they know from observing Tunisia and Egypt that this can happen so quickly and so unpredictably. And it has happened in the past in this country as well. It's been a long time, so they may not really have a sort of a collective memory of that, but the more intelligent members of the ruling class very much do have a collective memory of these things, and they are constantly trying to keep us off balance through their various mechanisms of control and propaganda to make sure that a mass movement does not develop and find its feet and become confident and become optimistic. That's what needs to happen, and it will happen. And to what degree it's effective is anybody's guess. But it'll happen again, no matter how much they try to prevent it, because we live in a profoundly unequal society, and we have profound global and national crises to deal with that they're not dealing with. I guess my last comment is always, and I know it's kind of cliche for like hardcore activist types to say things about the need to be hopeful and optimistic, but in the face of even very bleak times where we really don't get that many people out to protest the war criminals that run this country, people need to always remember everything can change very quickly, and never give up hope, and keep on doing something to make the world a better place. And people often want to know, what should I do? And the answer is, whatever you feel it might be worthwhile and might be effective, because the fact is, as Howard Zinn would always say when asked the question, there's 1,000 ways that you can make a difference and change things, and there's no, if anybody thinks they got the one way to do it, they're clearly mistaken.
And they will infiltrate us, provocateurs within our ranks. And if they can't divide us, they'll send the planes and tanks. But we will stand together, pacifists and zapatistas, workers, farmers, the indigenous, tree huggers and baristas. We'll shut them down.